Welcome to Timeless Love Stories. Tonight's story is an original romantic tale set in the backdrop of Second World War. If you enjoy slow-burn romance, deep emotion, and love stories shaped by history, consider subscribing to the channel. Now, let us begin. Catherine had long ceased to imagine her life in terms of expectation, not because she had been disappointed, but because expectation itself had gradually become irrelevant to the way her days were shaped. By the time she reached her mid-30s, the idea of a conventional existence, marriage, children, the steady unfolding of milestones recognized and approved by others, no longer felt like a path she had missed, but like a language she had once understood and then quietly set aside. She lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of a village in rural Wiltshire, where the land opened gently rather than dramatically, and where change arrived slowly enough to be absorbed without ceremony. The cottage stood at the end of a narrow lane bordered by hedgerows that grew thick and untidy in summer and austere in winter, their branches sheltering birds and muting sound. It was not a picturesque house. Its proportions were practical, its walls thick, its windows small and deliberate, as though it had been designed to keep the world at a manageable distance rather than to display itself within it. The garden, by contrast, carried the marks of intention. Catherine had shaped it over years of attentive labor, not into a space meant to impress, but into one that responded reliably to care. Paths edged with stone led between beds arranged for light and shelter rather than symmetry. There were vegetables grown for necessity, herbs for habit, and flowers only where they served a purpose beyond beauty, attracting insects or anchoring soil. In the mornings the garden smelled of damp earth and green growth. In the evenings it held the quiet satisfaction of work completed without witness. Her work as a bookkeeper suited her temperament precisely. She kept accounts for farmers, small businesses, and one larger agricultural concern whose ledgers grew heavier as the outside world became more uncertain. Catherine possessed a particular aptitude for noticing what others overlooked, the slow accumulation of inconsistencies, the small errors that, if ignored, could become unmanageable. Men who trusted little trusted her, not because she was warm or persuasive, but because she was exact. She traveled by bicycle along narrow roads, her ledger bag secured behind her, her movements efficient and unremarkable. She arrived on time, left on time, and carried with her the quiet authority of usefulness. When the war began, it did not arrive in her life as catastrophe, but as adjustment. At first it was a matter of language and administration. Newspapers grew heavier. Conversations slowed and acquired a careful tone. New forms appeared, new regulations, new categories of scarcity that required attention. Catherine's work became more demanding, not because the numbers themselves had changed, but because their consequences had. A mistake now meant more than embarrassment. It meant hunger somewhere else, or delay that could not be corrected. She adapted without complaint, bringing the same discipline to these changes that she brought to everything else. She listened to the wireless selectively. She had never enjoyed noise for its own sake, and the war broadcasts, with their solemn cadence and their careful assurances, felt less like information than intrusion. What she needed to know reached her regardless, in altered supply routes, in shortages, in the subtle tension that entered ordinary interactions. She did not consider her restraint avoidance. She considered it economy. It was then that Ellie first entered her life. She arrived from London in September 1939, as part of the early evacuations, stepping off a crowded train into a countryside that seemed to offend her instincts. She was 11 years old, small for her age, carrying a battered cardboard suitcase and wearing a coat ill-suited to rural weather. Her eyes were sharp and watchful, her posture rigid with the kind of obedience that conceals panic. Catherine noticed immediately the way the child scanned her surroundings, measuring distances, registering absences, unsettled by the openness of the land. The first weeks were marked by mutual incomprehension. Ellie's habits were shaped by the density of city life, noise as reassurance, movement as normality, the constant proximity of other bodies. Catherine's home, by contrast, offered space and quiet in abundance, and what Catherine experienced as calm Ellie experienced as exposure. The child complained about the food, about the silence, about the distance from shops and streets. She wandered restlessly through the cottage, opening cupboards, touching objects, as though searching for something familiar and failing to find it. Catherine responded not with indulgence, but with structure. She did not know how to soothe a child through affection delivered on command, and she distrusted sentimentality that was not grounded in consistency. Instead, she offered routine. Fixed times for meals. Clear expectations. Predictable boundaries. Ellie resisted at first, then leaned against these structures as though testing whether they would hold. Catherine discovered, to her own surprise, that she could hold them without cruelty. Consistency, she learned, could become a form of care. Gradually, adaptation began, not through agreement, but through repetition. Ellie learned the rhythms of the house, the sequence of days, the small rituals that marked time. Catherine involved her in simple tasks, watering plants, gathering eggs, kneading dough, not as obligation, but as anchoring. The child's hands learned the texture of soil, the resistance of dough, the patience required for things that could not be rushed. In the evenings, Catherine read aloud by the fire, choosing books that did not promise adventure or escape, but continuity. Ellie listened at first with skepticism, then with attention, and sometimes fell asleep before the end, her body surrendering to safety before her mind was prepared to admit it. Letters arrived from London at irregular intervals, and Ellie treated them with reverence. She read them repeatedly, folding and unfolding the paper until it softened at the edges, carrying it with her as though the words themselves might serve as protection. Catherine observed without comment, aware that these fragments of the child's former life were essential, not obstacles to adaptation. Ellie spoke often of her father, who was serving in the Navy. The pride with which she mentioned him was deliberate, rehearsed, as though repetition might secure his presence. Catherine did not contradict or complicate these narratives. She understood that children often required certainty before they could survive ambiguity. The first telegram arrived in the middle of the spring. Catherine recognized it immediately, even before opening it, the way one recognizes a change in weather by the quality of the air. The words were brief and merciless, stripped of detail and consolation. A ship sunk. A torpedo. A loss conveyed with administrative efficiency. Ellie read the message once, then again, her eyes moving over the lines as though meaning might shift with repetition. At first there was disbelief, a refusal so complete it bordered on logic. Then came anger, sharp and sudden, erupting without warning. Ellie shouted, accused, rejected the authority of the paper itself, as though the message were an intrusion that could be expelled by force of will. Catherine did not interrupt. She did not attempt to rationalize what could not be made reasonable. When Ellie's anger collapsed, it gave way not immediately to grief, but to absence. The child withdrew into a silence that frightened Catherine more than the earlier outburst. She stopped eating regularly. She sat for long periods staring into the garden, her hands idle, her posture slack. Catherine understood then that grief in children did not follow the patterns adults expected. It did not announce itself in orderly stages. It moved unpredictably, attaching itself to trivial moments, erupting and receding without warning. The spring that followed her father's death seemed to unfold like every other before. Catherine noticed it first in the garden, in the way growth resumed despite everything, green shoots forcing their way through soil that had not been asked whether it was ready. The days lengthened, light lingered in the evenings, birds returned to the hedgerows with a confidence that felt almost indecent. For Ellie, the season did not signify beginning, but exposure. Grief, no longer sharp with disbelief, had settled into her body as weight. In those early weeks, Ellie moved through the cottage as though carrying something fragile inside her that could shatter if handled too abruptly. She complied with routine without resistance, but without engagement. She ate because food was placed before her. She slept because exhaustion eventually overcame vigilance. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her voice sounded detached from intention, as if words had become unreliable instruments. Catherine did not attempt to hurry her. Instead, she adjusted in ways so small they barely registered as decisions. She reduced expectations without removing structure. Tasks were simplified, then reintroduced gradually. Ellie was not pressed to explain herself, nor was she allowed to disappear entirely into silence. Catherine remained present, consistent, attentive without hovering. She sat with Ellie in the evenings, sometimes reading aloud, sometimes simply occupying the same space, her presence a constant reference point against which Ellie could orient herself. Outside, the world was shifting. News from the continent grew darker as spring progressed. Catherine read the papers carefully, aware now that Ellie noticed not only what was said aloud, but what was withheld. One country after another fell, and the language of reporting hardened into patterns Catherine recognized too well: reassurance replacing explanation, explanation replaced by resolve. Ellie did not ask about the newspapers. She listened. She absorbed Catherine's silences, the moments when Catherine folded the paper more carefully than necessary, or set it aside without comment. Children, Catherine realized, learned the emotional weather of a household before they learned its facts. By late spring, the possibility of invasion had entered even the most practical conversations. The village did not panic. It recalibrated. Men spoke of coastal defenses, of patrols, of what might happen if. The conditional became part of everyday language. Catherine noticed how often people looked at the sky now, how attention drifted upward even during the most ordinary exchanges. Ellie noticed it too. She began to pause when aircraft passed overhead, her body stilling in a way Catherine had not seen before. At first, the sound was distant enough to be dismissed if one wished to misunderstand it. Catherine chose not to comment, careful not to give fear a shape Ellie could not yet manage. She continued her work as though nothing had occurred. As spring turned into summer, Ellie's grief began slowly to loosen its hold. Not because she forgot her father, but because she learned where to place the knowledge of his absence so that it did not press against every moment. She began to speak of him occasionally, not in the past tense she had once resisted, but carefully, as if testing whether his name could be spoken without consequence. Catherine listened without interruption, understanding that these moments were not invitations for reassurance, but for witness. The garden played its part. Ellie spent longer outside now, helping Catherine with small tasks, her hands learning the logic of soil and seed. There was comfort in work that followed rules older than war, in processes that did not accelerate under pressure. Catherine saw the change in Ellie's posture first, the way her shoulders lowered, the way her movements became less abrupt, less defensive. Summer settled heavily over Wiltshire, carrying with it a different kind of tension. The fear of invasion became a constant presence, not dramatic but persistent. Aircraft crossed the sky daily now, sometimes in numbers that made the air feel crowded. The Battle of Britain unfolded overhead, not as spectacle, but as sound, engines tearing at the sky, distant echoes that lingered longer than they should have. Ellie no longer pretended not to hear them. One afternoon, as they stood together at the edge of the garden, the sound passed overhead again, closer this time. "That's fighting," Ellie said quietly. Catherine glanced at her, surprised not by the statement, but by its calm. "Yes," she replied. Ellie nodded once and returned to her task, but Catherine noticed how the child stayed closer to her for the rest of the afternoon, as though proximity itself offered some measure of protection. By late summer, the immediate fear of invasion began to recede, replaced by a slower, more punishing certainty. The threat had not disappeared. It had changed direction. Air raids moved inland. London became the focus, night after night. Ellie began to listen more closely to the wireless, not for news of battles, but for references that confirmed the city's endurance. Catherine allowed this, understanding that for Ellie, London was not a strategic location but a repository of memory. Ellie's recovery during those weeks was not linear. There were days when she laughed easily, followed by evenings when she withdrew without explanation. There were moments of renewed appetite, curiosity, even impatience, and then sudden silences that reminded Catherine how provisional progress could be. Catherine learned not to treat these fluctuations as setbacks. Grief, she understood now, was not something Ellie moved through. It was something she learned to carry. Their relationship shifted accordingly. Catherine found herself thinking less in terms of care and more in terms of continuity. She no longer asked whether Ellie needed her. She assumed it, and acted from that assumption. She adjusted her work schedule further, ensuring she was home more consistently. She began to make plans that extended beyond the immediate weeks, noticing with a quiet shock that her future now included another person as a fixed element. Ellie, in turn, began to trust this. Not through declarations, but through behavior. She sought Catherine out when unsettled. She mirrored Catherine's routines without being told. She allowed herself to lean, physically, emotionally, in ways she had previously resisted, as though testing whether reliance would once again be punished by disappearance. By the time the first leaves began to turn, a fragile equilibrium had formed. It was then, at the very beginning of autumn, that the blitz began in earnest. The change was not announced. It was felt. Blackout regulations, once discussed in preparation, became mandatory. Catherine taped the windows, drew the curtains tight, and learned to move through the cottage by memory once the lamps were extinguished. She placed torches in predictable places, matches in more than one drawer, her movements efficient and unremarkable. One evening, as Catherine extinguished the lamp and adjusted the curtain until no light escaped, Ellie remained standing by the darkened window, her face pale in the faint glow of the fire. "They're doing it now," she said quietly, not as someone remembering, but as someone piecing things together. Catherine did not ask how she knew. "Yes," she replied. "In London." Ellie nodded once, slowly, as though placing the information where it belonged, alongside other things she had learned without witnessing them directly. She did not cry. There was nothing dramatic in her response, only the careful restraint of a child who had already learned that fear did not always announce itself loudly. That night, as they sat together in the dim light, Catherine understood that the balance they had built over the summer, tentative, hard-won, real, was about to be tested, and this time, there would be no distance that could keep the war entirely outside their lives. The second telegram arrived on an ordinary afternoon, which, Catherine would later understand, was part of its violence. She had been at the kitchen table, the ledgers open before her, the steady discipline of columns and figures offering a brief illusion of order. Ellie was upstairs, bent over her schoolwork, her pencil moving with the exaggerated care she adopted whenever she was trying to hold herself together. The house carried its usual sounds: the clock in the sitting room, the faint shift of timber as the temperature dropped, the muted rustle from above. The knock at the door was firm but unhurried. Catherine stood at once. She recognized the interval between the knock and the second that did not come. People bearing ordinary news knocked again. People carrying messages did not. The man on the doorstep avoided her eyes. He held the envelope with both hands, as though the paper itself required caution. Catherine accepted it, thanked him automatically, and closed the door with deliberate care, controlling the sound of it as if noise might make what she held more real. She did not open the telegram immediately. She stood in the narrow space of the hallway, the envelope heavy in her hand, listening to the house continue exactly as it had moments before. That continuity felt unbearable. Catherine understood then that the most difficult part of such messages was not the content, but the way they demanded that life divide itself into before and after without pause. When she unfolded the paper, the words were brutally economical. There was no explanation, no context, no space for doubt. An air raid. London. Killed. Ellie's mother. Catherine read the telegram twice, not because the meaning might change, but because she needed to absorb it in a way that would allow her to speak without breaking. She felt no rush of emotion, only a sharpening of focus, as if the world had narrowed suddenly to a single obligation. Ellie was still upstairs. Catherine went into the sitting room and sat down before calling her, anchoring herself physically, because she knew that Ellie would read her posture long before she understood her words. "Ellie," she called. The footsteps came quickly, then slowed on the last steps. Ellie entered the room already alert, her expression tightening as soon as she saw Catherine's face. "What is it?" she asked. Catherine placed the telegram on the table between them, her hand resting on it for a moment longer than necessary. "There's been a raid," she said, her voice low and steady. "In London." Lai's gaze remained fixed on her face, attentive but guarded, as though she already sensed the direction the sentence was taking. Catherine drew a slow breath. "Your mother was caught in it," she said, choosing the words with care, aware that each one would remain. "She didn't survive." For a brief second, Ellie seemed not to understand the sentence as a whole. Her eyes searched Catherine's face, not for explanation, but for correction, for any sign that what had been said could still be reshaped. Catherine did not look away. "She's gone," she added softly, not as repetition, but as clarification. "I'm so sorry." "No," she said quietly. "That's not right." Her voice carried neither anger nor disbelief, only refusal. Catherine did not contradict her. She moved closer and knelt beside Ellie's chair, close enough to be felt without touching. Ellie's breath caught, then collapsed into sobbing that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than lungs. She slid from the chair to the floor, clutching the paper to her chest, her body folding inward as though attempting to disappear. Catherine gathered her without hesitation, wrapping her arms around the child, holding her firmly enough to anchor her without restraining her. She did not speak. She allowed the grief to take the shape it needed, violent and disordered, because there was no honest way to soften it. They remained there for a long time. When Ellie's sobs eased into shuddering breaths, Catherine lifted her carefully and carried her upstairs. Ellie clung to her with an urgency that made it clear she was no longer asking for comfort, but for proof of presence. That night, Ellie slept in Catherine's bed. Catherine lay beside her, one arm around the child's shoulders, her hand resting lightly against Ellie's back, feeling each breath as though counting them mattered. The house was dark under blackout rules, the fire banked low, the silence heavy but intact. In the early hours, Ellie spoke without turning her head. "What happens now?" she asked. Catherine did not answer immediately. She understood that the question was not about arrangements or plans. It was about whether there was still an adult in the world who would remain. "We stay," Catherine said quietly. "We stay together." Ellie nodded once, slowly, as if placing the sentence somewhere safe. The days that followed did not resolve anything. They required endurance. Ellie's grief did not follow a predictable course. Some mornings she ate without comment. Other days she pushed food away untouched. She forgot small things, left doors open, abandoned tasks halfway through. She cried at unexpected moments and remained silent when Catherine anticipated tears. Catherine did not correct these fluctuations. She adjusted around them, maintaining structure without rigidity, presence without pressure. The village responded with a careful kindness that Catherine accepted selectively. She did not allow Ellie to be turned into a symbol of loss. Grief, she understood, required privacy as much as support. In the evenings, when the house settled into darkness, Ellie stayed close. She did not always seek touch, but she sought proximity, positioning herself within Catherine's line of sight, her body angled inward as though ensuring that disappearance was no longer possible. Catherine understood then, without needing to articulate it, that whatever had once been temporary had ended. Ellie's parents were both gone. There would be no return, no restoration, no life waiting elsewhere. The future they would inhabit would have to be built here, from what remained, by Catherine's steadiness and Ellie's gradual willingness to trust it. And Catherine, who had never imagined herself as anything other than solitary and sufficient, accepted this new orientation not as sacrifice, but as fact. Several weeks passed before Ethan appeared, long enough for the house to settle into a version of grief that could be lived with, but not long enough for Catherine to believe that the shape of their future was fixed. By then, winter had begun to loosen its hold, though the days remained short and the light unreliable. Ellie had returned gradually, to a form of routine that Catherine recognized as stability rather than recovery. She slept through most nights now. She ate with more regularity. She spoke when spoken to and sometimes when she was not, though her voice still carried a carefulness that had not been there before. Grief had not left her. It had changed position. Catherine did not assume this balance would hold. She had learned, over the previous year, that nothing established under the pressure of war was immune to interruption. The knock came late in the afternoon, firm but unhurried, carrying none of the hesitancy Catherine had come to associate with bad news. She opened the door without expectation and found a man standing on the threshold who looked, at first glance, entirely out of place in the narrow lane. He was taller than she had expected, his posture upright without stiffness, his coat travel-worn but carefully maintained. His hair was beginning to gray at the temples, though his face bore little else to suggest age. He held his hat in one hand, his other resting briefly against the doorframe as if grounding himself before speaking. "Miss Hartley?" he asked. Catherine nodded. "My name is Ethan Miller," he said. "I'm Ellie's uncle." Catherine felt the moment register not as shock, but as confirmation. She had known this visit would come eventually. Letters had been exchanged, formal at first, then more personal. Ethan had written with restraint, expressing gratitude, relief, and an unmistakable uncertainty about his own place in the arrangement that had formed without him. Catherine had replied carefully, offering clarity without presumption. She stepped aside at once. Ethan removed his hat as he entered, his eyes already scanning the space with the instinct of someone trained to read environments. He took in the size of the room, the worn furniture, the quiet order of the house without comment. His gaze paused briefly on Ellie, who stood halfway up the stairs, watching him with undisguised attention. "Ellie," he said gently. The child descended the remaining steps slowly, stopping a few feet away from him. She did not rush forward, nor did she retreat. She studied him with the same careful scrutiny Catherine had seen her apply to every adult since the war began. Ellie stopped on the last step, her hand resting on the banister, and looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "Your Uncle Ethan," she said, not as a question, but as recognition resurfacing. "Mum used to talk about you." Ethan's expression softened at once, the guarded politeness he had brought with him giving way to something more exposed. "Yes," he said quietly. "I am." Ellie nodded, accepting the confirmation without ceremony, as though the name itself were enough to establish the connection. She did not move closer, but she did not retreat either. Catherine noticed the care with which the child held herself, the way familiarity did not automatically translate into trust. Catherine watched the exchange with an alertness that surprised her by its intensity. She became aware, almost too late, of the way her body had shifted slightly toward Ellie, a subtle repositioning that placed her, without conscious intent, between the child and the man at the door. The reaction was instinctive rather than reasoned, and it unsettled her precisely because she had not chosen it. Until that moment, Catherine had not fully acknowledged the possibility that Ellie might be claimed. She had known, abstractly, that family existed elsewhere, that arrangements made under pressure were always provisional. Yet seeing Ethan there, calm, composed, indisputably legitimate, forced the recognition into sharper focus. Whatever the law might allow to be adjusted, blood carried its own authority, one that could not be negotiated with quiet competence alone. The thought tightened something low in her chest. She did not resent Ethan. She did not mistrust him. What unsettled her was the sudden awareness that the life she and Ellie had built, carefully and without declaration, might be more fragile than she had allowed herself to consider. And that, more than anything, made her hold Ellie just a little closer, even as she welcomed him inside. Ethan did not stay long that first day. They spoke at the table while Ellie listened from the hearth, pretending to read. Ethan asked practical questions, the kind Catherine had come to value, about Ellie's schooling, about routines, about health. He did not ask Catherine why she had taken Ellie in. He assumed the answer lay in evidence rather than explanation. When he left, he did so without drama, thanking Catherine with a sincerity that felt measured rather than performative. "I'm grateful," he said simply. "More than I can say." Catherine nodded. Gratitude, she had learned, was not something that required elaboration. After that, Ethan began to visit with regularity. At first, the visits were spaced weeks apart, then days. He arrived at different times, sometimes staying for supper, sometimes only long enough to walk with Ellie along the lane or sit with her in the garden. Catherine noticed immediately the effect his presence had on the child. Ellie changed when Ethan was there. She spoke more freely, asked questions she did not direct at Catherine, laughed in a way that surprised them both. There was something about his manner, quiet, observant, unforced, that seemed to allow Ellie to relax without vigilance. He did not attempt to parent her. He did not correct her unnecessarily. He treated her as a person whose responses mattered. One evening, after Ethan had left, Ellie lingered in the kitchen longer than usual. "He's not like I thought," she said. Catherine waited. "I thought he'd be sadder," Ellie continued. "Or stricter." Catherine considered this. "He's careful," she said at last. Ellie nodded, satisfied. For Catherine, Ethan's visits brought an unexpected recalibration. She had not realized how thoroughly she had been carrying the weight of Ellie's world alone until that weight shifted briefly into another pair of hands. It was not that she resented the responsibility. It was that sharing it revealed the extent of what she had assumed without complaint. One evening, after Ethan had stayed late enough for the lamps to be lit, he remained standing by the door, his coat on, his hat in hand. "I've been thinking," he said, "about arrangements." Catherine met his gaze steadily. "I don't know how to do this alone," he continued. "I don't mean that as reluctance. I mean it as fact. I'm not made for solitary domesticity, and I wouldn't pretend otherwise." Catherine did not interrupt. "I'm relieved," he said, "to see Ellie with you. Truly. She's safe here." The word safe carried weight. "If you were willing," he went on, "I could relocate. Temporarily, at least. My work allows it." Catherine felt the suggestion land with surprising calm. They discussed the matter over several evenings, not as negotiation, but as alignment. Ethan explained his work as a topographer, the surveys he conducted, the way the Ministry of Agriculture increasingly required updated assessments of rural land as production became strategic. He could base himself nearby, travel out for assignments, remain present without disruption. Ellie listened to these conversations with interest rather than anxiety. When the decision was made, it felt less like a change than a clarification. Once Ethan moved into the cottage, life did not rearrange itself dramatically. It adjusted, the way all durable things did, by a series of small accommodations that only revealed their importance after they had already become necessary. The spare room at the back of the house, which had long served as storage for things Catherine did not need often enough to discard, took on a different function. Ethan's belongings were few and carefully chosen. He unpacked without ceremony, placing his shirts in one drawer, his papers in another, his boots neatly by the door. He asked where things belonged rather than assuming, learned quickly which shelves were used daily and which were left untouched. Catherine noticed this attention with a quiet appreciation. She had learned over the years that respect often announced itself not through words but through small actions. Ellie adapted even faster than Catherine had expected. At first, she treated Ethan's presence as merely temporary, a visitor extended rather than a fixture, but familiarity returned more easily than trust, and trust followed soon after. She began to involve him in her routines, showing him the parts of the garden she preferred, asking him to explain his maps, sitting beside him at the table while he worked through figures and measurements that meant nothing to her but fascinated her nonetheless. Ethan responded without indulgence or condescension. He did not attempt to replace what had been lost. He did not speak of Ellie's parents unless she raised the subject herself. When she did, he answered honestly and briefly, understanding that over-elaboration risked turning memory into burden. He treated Ellie not as a fragile object, but as a person whose grief had already taught her more than most adults wanted to acknowledge. Catherine observed all of this from a position that was no longer neutral. She had grown accustomed to carrying responsibility alone, and the redistribution of it unsettled her at first. She found herself listening more closely to conversations she did not participate in, noticing how Ellie's posture shifted when Ethan entered a room, how her voice softened without disappearing. Relief arrived unexpectedly, and with it a quiet guilt, as though allowing someone else to shoulder part of the load constituted a failure rather than a necessary evolution. Over time, relief replaced guilt. The days developed a structure that belonged to all three of them. Mornings were efficient. Catherine rose first, as she always had, but now the house did not remain silent for long. Ethan followed soon after, his movements careful at first, then more assured as he learned which floorboards protested and which did not. Ellie joined them last, her presence announcing itself through sound rather than reluctance. Breakfasts were unhurried, conversation minimal but companionable. Silence, when it occurred, felt shared rather than empty. Ethan's work for the Ministry of Agriculture gave shape to the weeks. He left early on some days, returning with mud on his boots and folded maps tucked under his arm, or spent entire mornings at the table tracing boundaries, checking measurements, making notes that Catherine recognized as the visible residue of concentration. He spoke little about his assignments, not out of secrecy, but because he understood that his work mattered less than the continuity it supported. Food production, land management, quiet forms of fighting. Catherine respected that instinctively. Her own work continued much as before, though she adjusted her schedule with a freedom she had not previously allowed herself. Knowing that Ellie was not alone when she was absent changed the shape of her attention. She worked more efficiently, returned home with less urgency, her mind no longer pulled taut by constant calculation. The war settled into the background of their lives with an inevitability that felt almost indecent. Rationing became routine. Blackouts became habit. News arrived at predictable hours, its cadence no longer startling, its content absorbed selectively. They learned which updates mattered and which could be endured without comment. Fear did not disappear. It redistributed itself, becoming less acute and more constant, a pressure rather than a wound. Ellie adjusted accordingly. She no longer startled at every aircraft overhead, though she still paused, listening, her body attentive. Catherine noticed that the child had begun to take cues not only from her, but from Ethan as well, calibrating her responses against both adults, testing the stability of the structure they were building. In the evenings, they gathered by the fireplace. Sometimes Catherine read aloud. Sometimes Ethan brought out his maps, and Ellie traced the lines with her finger, inventing stories about the fields and roads they represented. Other nights they sat in companionable quiet, the sound of the fire and the clock marking time more effectively than any conversation. It was during these evenings that Catherine began to notice the shift between herself and Ethan. At first, it registered only as ease. She found herself speaking without premeditation, finishing thoughts aloud that she would once have kept internal. She noticed that Ethan listened with a quality of attention she rarely encountered, not interrupting, not steering, allowing silence to remain intact rather than filling it. Their conversations grew less transactional, more reflective, though neither of them named this change. Attraction did not announce itself suddenly. It arrived through observation. Catherine noticed the way Ethan moved through the garden, attentive, adjusting his steps to avoid damaging beds he had not planted. She noticed the care with which he handled Ellie's trust, never assuming it, never demanding it. She noticed, too, the way he treated her own independence not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as a given to be respected. Ethan, for his part, became aware of Catherine in ways that surprised him. He had noticed her competence immediately, the quiet authority with which she organized both work and home. What took longer to register was the depth beneath that competence, the way she absorbed disruption without complaint, the steadiness with which she held Ellie's grief without allowing it to eclipse either of them. He noticed her hands, capable and precise, the way she moved through the house as though it were an extension of her thinking. Neither spoke of these observations. They manifested instead in small adjustments. Ethan lingered longer in the kitchen when Catherine worked there. Catherine found herself timing her own tasks to coincide with his returns. When their hands brushed, Neither withdrew too quickly. Ellie noticed before either of them acknowledged it. Children, Catherine realized, often sensed shifts long before adults gave them language. Ellie began to place herself deliberately between them at the table, as though reinforcing the configuration. She included both of them in her plans, spoke of us with increasing confidence, her grammar rearranging itself around the reality she was inhabiting. One evening, as Catherine prepared supper and Ethan washed the vegetables Ellie had brought in from the garden, the child looked from one adult to the other and smiled. "This feels like a proper house," she said. The statement was simple. Its weight was not. Catherine paused, her hands still in the basin. Ethan glanced at her, then back at Ellie. "I think it is," he said. No one added anything further. That night, after Ellie had gone to bed, Catherine and Ethan remained by the fire longer than usual. The conversation drifted without direction, touching lightly on work, on weather, on nothing that required resolution. At some point, the silence settled in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Ethan spoke first. "I'm glad I stayed," he said. Catherine nodded. "So am I." Neither elaborated. They did not need to. The war continued beyond the hedgerows, its demands unrelenting, its presence unavoidable. But within the cottage, something had taken shape that resisted erosion. They did not think of themselves as brave. They did not imagine themselves exceptional. They adapted. They shared responsibility. They learned one another's rhythms. They allowed attraction to exist without insisting it declare itself before the ground beneath it was secure. And in doing so they became, not by design, but by repetition, a family assembled from circumstance, sustained by choice, and gradually transformed by the quiet emergence of something more. There came a point when Catherine could no longer persuade herself that what was forming between herself and Ethan belonged solely to the category of shared responsibility. The shift did not announce itself dramatically. It arrived through accumulation, through moments that resisted being filed away as incidental. She noticed it in the way her attention altered when Ethan entered a room, in how her body registered his presence before her thoughts supplied any particular interpretation. She noticed it, too, in the care with which she now managed her own restraint, as though instinct and discipline were renegotiating their boundaries. Days were purposeful. Evenings were warm. Ellie moved through the house with the unself-conscious assurance of a child who no longer questioned whether she belonged. She spoke easily of home now, using the word without hesitation, her certainty both comforting and quietly binding. It was that certainty that made Catherine cautious. She understood how fragile such confidence could be, how quickly it might be undone by change presented without care. Ethan shared that understanding. Neither of them spoke openly of what was shifting between them, not because they were unaware of it, but because they recognized how deeply Ellie's stability depended on the continuity of the household as it stood. Restraint, however, did not lessen attraction. It refined it. Catherine became acutely aware of Ethan in the intervals between tasks, in the moments when they passed one another in the narrow kitchen and the space between them seemed suddenly insufficient. She noticed the cadence of his voice when he spoke quietly, the way his expression softened when Ellie laughed, the steadiness with which he inhabited rooms that were not his by origin but had become so by care. Ethan, for his part, found the discipline he imposed on himself increasingly exacting. He had lived much of his adult life alone, his work lending itself to mobility rather than attachment. The intimacy of shared domestic space unsettled him not because it overwhelmed him, but because it revealed how readily he adapted to it. Catherine was everywhere, not as intrusion, but as presence, quiet, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Admiration slid gradually into desire, unannounced but unmistakable. The moment they finally acknowledged this came not in gesture, but in speech. It was late evening. Ellie had gone to bed early, worn out by a day spent outdoors. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the room. Catherine stood at the table folding laundry with mechanical precision, her movements betraying a focus she did not entirely feel. "Catherine," Ethan said. She looked up. The seriousness of his expression arrested her at once. There was no urgency in it, no impatience. Only a clarity that stripped the moment of ambiguity. "We should talk," he said. Catherine set the folded linen down carefully, as though the act itself required deliberation. "Yes," she replied. "We should." They remained standing. Sitting would have implied safety. Instead, they faced one another across the narrow space, the table between them an inadequate division. "I don't want to complicate what we've built," Ethan said. "Ellie comes first." "I know," Catherine replied. "She does." Silence settled, not empty but weighted. "This isn't something I planned," he continued, choosing his words with care. "But it's no longer something I can ignore." Catherine met his gaze steadily. "For me either," she said. The admission was spare, but it carried the weight of finality. It was not a confession of feeling so much as a recognition of reality. They stood there for several seconds, the tension between them no longer masked by denial. When Ethan moved, it was slowly, deliberately, as though offering Catherine the chance to refuse without having to say so. She did not step back. He closed the space between them without touching her at first, his proximity alone altering the air between them. "We've been careful," he said quietly. "Yes," Catherine replied. "But care doesn't require avoidance." The truth of the statement settled between them. When he kissed her, it was unhurried and deliberate, his hand resting lightly at her waist, her fingers curling instinctively into the sleeve of his shirt. Catherine felt the contact register not as shock, but as recognition, an outward expression of something already decided inwardly. There was no hesitation after that. They moved upstairs without urgency, without haste born of secrecy or fear. What followed was intimate without spectacle, shaped by attentiveness rather than impulse. Desire unfolded slowly, informed by trust rather than novelty. Catherine found herself present in her body in a way she had not anticipated, the years of discipline and self-sufficiency not erased but integrated, lending the intimacy a steadiness that felt unmistakably her own. Ethan moved with the same deliberation, his touch guided as much by listening as by intent, responsive rather than insistent. What passed between them was intense without excess, a mutual exploration grounded in choice rather than escape. Afterwards, they lay awake together in the dim room, the fire below reduced to embers, the house breathing around them. "We shouldn't tell her yet," Catherine said softly. "Not because this isn't real," Ethan replied at once. "Because it is." "She's learned to expect loss," Catherine continued. "I don't want her wondering if this will disappear too." Ethan turned toward her, his expression steady. "I'm not here temporarily," he said. "But I understand waiting." Catherine believed him. Belief, she knew, was not proof, but it was the beginning of it. They agreed then, without drama or negotiation, to keep what had begun between them private for the time being. Not hidden out of shame, but held back out of care. What mattered did not require announcement to exist. Downstairs, the house remained unchanged, quiet, intact, holding the shape of the life they had built. And neither of them yet accounted for how closely Ellie had already been watching, or how little truly escaped her notice. They believed briefly that what had begun between them could be held apart from the rest of the house, unaware that in a place shaped by shared attention, nothing significant remained unseen for long. The complication arrived quietly, without announcement, and in a form neither of them would have anticipated. It arrived on 4 legs. Ethan found the dog on a narrow track several miles from the cottage, where the hedgerows thinned and the land dipped toward a shallow stream swollen by winter rain. He had finished a long day of surveying, boots heavy with mud, notes folded and tucked away, his thoughts already drifting toward the warmth of the house and the careful equilibrium waiting there, when he noticed a shape near the verge that did not move when he approached. At first, he thought it was debris caught by the wind. Then the shape lifted its head. The dog was thin, his ribs visible beneath a coat dulled by neglect rather than age. One ear folded forward permanently, the other alert despite exhaustion. He did not bark. He did not retreat. He simply watched Ethan with a gaze that held neither fear nor expectation, as though experience had taught him that both were wasted effort. Ethan stopped. He crouched slowly, careful not to crowd the animal, extending a hand without reaching. The dog remained still, his body trembling slightly, whether from cold or restraint Ethan could not tell. "Well," Ethan murmured, more to himself than to the dog. "You've had a difficult time." The dog's tail moved once, barely. That was enough. Ethan removed his coat and placed it carefully over the animal's back, aware that the gesture was impractical and insufficient and yet unavoidable. The dog allowed it, leaning subtly into the unfamiliar warmth, and after a moment's hesitation, followed when Ethan resumed walking. By the time they reached the cottage, dusk had already settled. Catherine heard them before she saw them, unfamiliar steps on gravel, the soft scrape of claws against stone, the pause at the door that signaled uncertainty rather than decision. She opened it without thinking and found Ethan on the threshold, tired and mud-streaked, with the dog standing close to his leg as though claiming him. Catherine took in the scene in a single glance. "What happened?" she asked. "I found him," Ethan said simply. "He wouldn't stay behind." The dog looked past Catherine into the house, his attention sharpening. Ellie appeared almost immediately behind her, drawn by instinct more than sound. She stopped short when she saw the animal, her breath catching in a way that was not alarm but recognition. "Oh," she said softly. She knelt without waiting for permission, her hand hovering briefly before touching the dog's neck, careful even in excitement. The dog accepted the contact without flinching, his body still tense but receptive. "He's hungry," Ellie said, not as speculation, but as certainty. "Yes," Catherine replied. "So are we." No discussion followed. Catherine fetched water. Ethan found food. Ellie remained beside the dog, speaking to him in a low voice that carried neither command nor expectation, her presence steady and unintrusive. The dog ate slowly, pausing often, as though unsure the food would not be withdrawn. That night, he slept by the hearth. Ellie insisted on arranging a blanket herself, folding it with care and placing it with the seriousness of ritual. Catherine allowed it without comment, recognizing that something important was being negotiated that had nothing to do with ownership. They called him Bramble, a name that suited his quiet resilience. Bramble stayed. He adapted to the house with the same attentiveness Ellie herself had once shown, learning where warmth gathered, where feet passed most often, where voices softened. He followed Ethan out of rooms and Catherine into the garden, slept where Ellie could see him, and occasionally disappeared without warning, reappearing only when called with sufficient patience. It was during one of these disappearances that the careful balance Catherine and Ethan had been maintaining finally shifted. Ellie had been sent upstairs to fetch a book she had left in her room. Halfway up the stairs, she realized Bramble was no longer padding behind her. She stopped, listened, then turned back, retracing her steps with the determined focus she reserved for small mysteries. "Bramble?" she called softly. No answer. She checked the kitchen first, then the back room, moving quietly out of habit rather than intention. When she reached the sitting room, she paused at the threshold. Bramble was there, half hidden behind the armchair, his body tense with the unmistakable pleasure of having successfully avoided notice. His tail gave a single, betraying movement. Ellie followed his line of sight. Catherine and Ethan stood near the window, close enough that explanation would have been unnecessary even if words had been available. Ethan's hand rested at Catherine's waist. Catherine's fingers were curled into the front of his shirt. They were kissing, not hurriedly, not furtively, but with the absorbed stillness of people who had momentarily forgotten the rest of the room. Ellie did not gasp. She did not interrupt. She stood very still, taking in the scene with the same careful attention she had learned to apply to everything that mattered. Bramble chose that moment to step forward, tail wagging, his presence impossible to ignore. Catherine broke away first, awareness returning with sudden clarity. She turned and saw Ellie in the doorway. For a brief instant, her instinct was to speak, to apologize, to explain, to restore order through words. She did none of these things. Ellie spoke first. "Oh," she said. It was not accusation. It was recognition. Ethan stepped back slightly, not in retreat, but in acknowledgement of being seen. Ellie's gaze moved between them, then dropped to Bramble, who had settled at her feet as though nothing of consequence had occurred. "So that's what you've been doing," Ellie said thoughtfully. "When you think I'm not looking." Catherine drew a slow breath. "We didn't want to worry you," she said carefully. "Or make you think things were changing again." Ellie frowned. "Things always change." Catherine nodded. "Yes. But not everything disappears." Ellie considered this in silence. Then she nodded, as though arriving at a conclusion she had been approaching for some time. "I think it's better this way," she said. "People are nicer when they're honest." Ethan smiled despite himself. Ellie looked at him directly. "You're not leaving, are you?" "No," he said at once. "I'm not." She accepted that without further interrogation, then crouched beside Bramble, scratching behind his ears. "He hides when he knows he's done something," she said. "But he always comes back." The remark lingered in the room after she left. That evening, the house felt subtly reoriented, not unsettled but clarified, as though something that had been held too carefully had finally been allowed to take its proper place. After Ellie had gone to bed, Catherine and Ethan sat by the fire with Bramble between them, the dogs breathing slow and even. "She knew," Ethan said quietly. "Yes," Catherine replied. "She always does." They did not regret their caution. They understood now that protection did not always require concealment. Sometimes it required trust. Ellie slept more deeply after that. She began to speak of the future with a confidence that surprised Catherine, of school, of gardens she wanted to plant, of walks she would take with Bramble once he was stronger. She spoke of us without hesitation, her language reshaping itself around the stability she sensed rather than feared. The romance between Catherine and Ethan no longer required secrecy. It remained restrained, deliberate, shaped around the child who had already endured too much impermanence. But it was no longer hidden, no longer tentative in its existence. The war continued. But inside the cottage, something had taken root that did not depend on victory or resolution. They had not replaced what was lost. They had built something else, slowly, consciously and together, and Catherine allowed herself, for the first time, to believe that what they were creating might endure, not in spite of uncertainty, but because they had learned how to live within it. For a brief stretch of time, life settled into a version of itself that felt almost complete, as though the careful choices they had made were finally being allowed to hold without immediate consequence. Then change came. It happened on a day so ordinary that Catherine would later struggle to accept that anything irreversible had even been possible within it. The morning had unfolded with the same steady logic their household had come to rely on, the kind of routine that did not erase the war beyond the hedgerows but contained it, holding it at a manageable distance. Catherine had spent the earlier hours in the garden, hands in the soil, thinking in quiet sequences. What needed planting, what needed trimming, what could be preserved for later. Ellie had moved in and out of the work with the mild restlessness of a child who belonged to the place now, attentive enough to help, young enough to drift. Ethan had been away for part of the day, a brief survey assignment in a neighboring parish. He had left early, returning sooner than expected, his boots damp with mud and his coat smelling faintly of rain and hedgerow. By the time the afternoon settled in, the three of them were back in their familiar pattern. Ellie upstairs with a book she insisted she was reading for school, Catherine at the table with papers and accounts she could not entirely abandon, Ethan in the yard checking a loose hinge he had promised to fix. Bramble moved between them all, quiet but alert, as if his loyalty required constant confirmation. Nothing in the house felt precarious in that moment. The windows were cracked open for air. The fire was low. Even the distant sounds from the village seemed harmless, folded into the day like background music. It was precisely that ordinariness that made what followed so violent. Bramble's disappearance went unnoticed at first. Catherine assumed he had followed Ethan outside. Ethan assumed the dog had stayed with Catherine. Ellie, for her part, had been half listening to the sounds below while turning pages upstairs, the way children did when they were not entirely alone but not entirely accompanied either. Then Bramble made a choice. He slipped out through the back gate, drawn by a scent or movement that only he understood, and once he was beyond the yard, he did not stop to consider whether he was being followed. Ellie noticed his absence a few minutes later. She came down the stairs quickly, calling his name with a familiar impatience that carried more affection than irritation, and when there was no answering scramble of paws on the floorboards, she went to the door and looked out. The lane beyond the cottage was visible from there, quiet, empty in the way rural roads often were. Ellie's decision was immediate. She did not tell Catherine. She did not think to do so. She simply stepped outside and ran, following the direction her instincts suggested, her mind occupied only by the simple urgency of retrieving what belonged to them. The accident happened beyond the cottage's view, around the bend where the lane narrowed and dipped. No one from the house witnessed it. A bicycle came down the lane at speed, its rider, later described by neighbors as a young man, hurried, careless, distracted, rounding the bend too quickly to respond in time to a child who darted into the road. There was a shout. Then the unmistakable sound of impact, metal, gravel, a body striking ground. When Catherine learned of it, it was not through sound, but through interruption. A knock came at the door, sharp, urgent, repeated before Catherine could even reach it. She opened it to find Mrs. Hargreaves from up the lane standing on the threshold, breathless and pale, her hands trembling as though she had tried to hold herself steady and failed. Catherine felt her stomach drop before any words were spoken. "It's Ellie," Mrs. Hargreaves said. "It's Ellie. There's been an accident. On the lane." The sentence fractured Catherine's sense of time. Ellie. Accident. Hospital. Catherine felt the room tilt, not physically but perceptually, the edges of things losing their usual clarity. She heard herself ask something, where, when, how, but she could not later recall the answers. What mattered was the absence. Ellie was not upstairs. She was not in the garden. She was not anywhere Catherine could reach. Ethan appeared almost immediately, drawn by the sound of Catherine's voice and the quality of silence that followed it. "What is it?" he asked. Catherine turned to him, her face already stripped of color. "It's Ellie," she said. "She's been hurt." They did not argue about who would drive. They did not pause to collect coats or explanations. They left the house as it was, the door closing behind them with a sound Catherine would remember later, because it marked the moment when fear became dominant again. The journey to the hospital was made without conversation. Ethan drove too fast, then forced himself to slow, then sped up again, caught between urgency and the knowledge that arriving safely was the only remaining form of control. Catherine sat beside him, hands clenched in her lap, her mind filling the silence with images she could not restrain. Ellie alone on the road. Ellie calling out. Ellie not calling out at all. Neither of them spoke these thoughts aloud. They did not need to. The car carried them like a sealed container for panic, every mile stretching the distance between uncertainty and whatever waited at the end of it. By the time they arrived, Ellie had already been treated. They were told this before they were allowed to see her, and the sentence landed with a force Catherine had not anticipated. Treated meant alive. Treated meant conscious. Treated meant there had been time she had not been present for, time in which strangers had touched her child where Catherine should have been. She sat because she was told to sit. She waited because there was nothing else she could do. Her hands shook. She stared at them, surprised by their unfamiliarity, as though they belonged to someone else entirely. Ethan sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, neither seeking comfort nor offering it, both simply ensuring that the other remained real. The silence between them held everything they could not say, the terror, the helplessness, the sudden, violent understanding that parenthood, unplanned, assembled, chosen, carried the same capacity for devastation as any bloodbound tie. When the doctor finally appeared, Catherine stood so abruptly that the chair scraped loudly across the floor. The doctor's expression was already shaped into reassurance, and Catherine seized it before she even heard the words. "She's very lucky," he said. "Scrapes and bruising, and a mild concussion. No fractures. No internal injuries. She'll be sore, but she'll recover fully." The relief did not arrive as softness. It arrived as collapse postponed. Catherine nodded once, then again, as though repetition were required for belief. Ethan let out a breath that sounded almost like pain. They were taken through a corridor and into a small room. Ellie lay on the bed, smaller than Catherine expected, her face cleaned, her hair brushed back, a bandage wrapped around one knee. Her eyes were closed at first, then fluttered open when she sensed them. The sight of them, together present, seemed to ease something in her immediately. "Mum," Ellie said. The word was quiet, unexamined, instinctive. Catherine's breath caught. She crossed the room in 2 steps and sat down, taking Ellie's hand with both of hers, grounding herself in the warmth of it. "I'm here," she said. "I'm here." Ethan stood on the other side of the bed, one hand gripping the rail as though he needed something solid to hold him in place. Ellie looked between them, her brow furrowing slightly. "I'm sorry," she said. Catherine leaned closer, her voice low and fierce. "Don't," she said. "Don't ever be sorry for being alive." Ellie blinked, absorbing the intensity, and then her gaze drifted, memory returning with gentler insistence. "Where's Bramble?" she asked. The question tightened something in Catherine's chest. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But we'll find him." Ellie's eyes moved at once to Ethan. "Go," she said. Ethan frowned. "Ellie." "Please," she insisted, her voice stronger than Catherine expected. "He ran. He'll be scared." Catherine understood then what Ellie was doing. She was refusing to allow the day to end in loss. She was insisting that something that had fled could still be brought back. It was not denial. It was agency. Ethan looked to Catherine. Catherine nodded once, slowly. "Go," she said. "I'll stay with her." Ethan hesitated only long enough to squeeze Ellie's fingers gently, then turned and left. He searched the village as dusk settled, calling Bramble's name softly, repeatedly, without anger or desperation in his voice. He spoke to neighbors, to shopkeepers, to anyone who might have seen a thin brown dog moving too quickly for his own safety. He walked the lane where the accident had happened and forced himself not to stop there. Back at the hospital, Catherine stayed beside Ellie, watching her breathing deepen as exhaustion finally claimed her. Catherine did not sleep. She sat and listened to the hum of the building, the distant footsteps, the muted voices, and did not allow herself to imagine the alternative version of the day. Late in the evening, Ethan returned. He came into the room quietly, and for a moment Catherine saw only his outline in the doorway. Then Bramble stepped forward beside him, muddy, shaken, but unmistakably intact. Catherine's hand went to her mouth. Ellie stirred, eyes opening, and when she saw the dog, her expression changed completely, relief spreading across her face like warmth. "I told you," she whispered. Bramble jumped up carefully, placing his front paws against the edge of the bed, sniffing Ellie's hand as if confirming that she was real. Ellie's fingers curled into his fur, anchoring herself in the simplest truth available. They were together, and nothing had been taken. Catherine looked at Ethan across the bed. No words were necessary. The scare had not changed who they were. It had clarified it. Love, she understood now, was not gentleness. It was risk. It was responsibility. It was the willingness to imagine loss, and to choose connection anyway. And yet, that night, nothing was lost. Ellie survived. Bramble came back. The house would still be there in the morning. When they eventually returned home, tired and shaken, the cottage received them with its familiar stillness. Catherine crossed the threshold with Ellie leaning against her, Ethan close behind, Bramble's lead loose in his hand, as though none of them were willing to allow even a small distance between them again. In the quiet that followed, Catherine understood something with a clarity she would not forget. It was not perfection that made their life worth defending. It was the fact that, when everything almost broke, they ran toward one another, and they came back together. The years did not pass in a single clean movement, as Catherine might once have imagined they should, with a clear line dividing war from peace and hardship from relief. Instead, time continued as it always had, by seasons, by small changes that announced themselves only after they had already taken root. When the war ended, there was no moment in the cottage that felt like a door opening onto a new world. There was, rather, a gradual loosening. The wireless began to carry different kinds of voices. The village spoke less often of rationing and more often of repairs. The blackout curtains, once drawn with precision and unease, were folded away and stored with the same care Catherine gave to everything she might one day need again. The sky remained the same sky, but it sounded different. In the house, noise became the most obvious marker of the new world. It arrived first in laughter, tentative at the beginning, then increasingly unguarded, as if the body itself had to relearn how to release joy without fearing punishment for it. It arrived in footsteps that moved quickly without urgency, in doors left slightly ajar, in the occasional argument that ended not in silence but in reconciliation. It arrived, most of all, in the sound of a second child. The baby, Rose, named with a simplicity that felt like deliberate hope, had come into their lives after the war had already ended, when Catherine and Ethan had finally allowed themselves to believe that planning was not arrogance. Catherine had been older than most new mothers in the village, and she had felt the weight of that fact keenly at first, not out of vanity but out of practical awareness. Yet when Rose arrived, small and furious and undeniably alive, Catherine experienced a quiet shift that no speech could have expressed. It was not that she loved Ellie less, or differently. It was that love did not divide. It expanded. Ellie, by then, was old enough to understand what the baby represented and young enough to respond to it instinctively. Catherine watched her closely at first, alert to signs of jealousy or retreat, wary of what new beginnings might awaken in a child who had once lost everything that anchored her. Instead, Ellie surprised her. She approached Rose with a quiet seriousness, learned quickly how to hold her, how to respond to her cries, how to remain present without intruding. What began as tenderness became confidence. By adolescence, Ellie could soothe her sister more easily than anyone else, her voice steady, her movements sure. Catherine was careful not to mistake willingness for obligation. She asked for help, never for sacrifice, understanding that childhood should not be spent repaying losses it had not chosen. Ellie helped because she wanted to, because Rose was hers in the only way that mattered, and because belonging, for Ellie, had always been something she enacted rather than assumed. Catherine's work continued, as it had always done, with the same quiet steadiness. Even when the house grew loud, when Rose toddled through rooms in search of whatever. Ethan changed more visibly than Catherine did, though the essence of him remained constant. The man who had once arrived at their door as a divorced topographer with no children and little practice in domestic life would have been almost unrecognizable to his earlier self. Not because he had been remade into someone else, but because he had finally committed to a life that required staying. He no longer traveled for agricultural surveys the way he once had. Post-war England demanded different measurements now. There were new lines to draw, new boundaries to consider, new spaces to make habitable. Ethan's work shifted accordingly, away from fields and toward foundations. He measured plots for new houses, assessed ground for rebuilding, worked with men who carried the same tired determination he saw everywhere in the country, the resolve to put things back together, even if they could never be returned to what they had been. He was, without trying to perform it, an excellent father. Not perfect. Catherine had never desired perfection, but present, attentive, willing. He listened to Ellie's long adolescent explanations without dismissing them. He took Rose outside when Catherine needed quiet. He built small things with his hands, shelves, a cradle, later a stool for Rose to stand on at the table, quiet manifestations of a love that did not need speech to be understood. Ellie, watching him, learned something quieter and more durable than reassurance. That presence was not guaranteed by blood or promise, but by the repeated choice to remain, even when leaving would have been easier. Outside, the village still bore the marks of what it had endured. Some houses remained patched rather than rebuilt. Some families remained incomplete. People carried grief in quieter forms now, not spoken of constantly but never fully absent. The world was new, yes, but it was not innocent. Neither were they. And Bramble ran, as he always had, disappearing beyond sight and returning without urgency, as though proving again and again that permanence was not a lack of movement, but a willingness to come back. They had learned, all of them, that things could be lost and still rebuilt, that fear could exist alongside joy, that love was not the promise that nothing would break. It was the choice to return, again and again, to one another. Thank you for listening to this story. If it stayed with you, you are warmly invited to like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. New timeless love stories await you. Until next time.